In front of a packed terminal, Rashad handed his crying wife their feverish son, and his mother sneered, "You were never first-class material." Then he boarded with his mistress on his arm. Travelers looked away. The boarding call echoed through the gate. What nobody realized was that every plane waiting on that runway, every ticket being scanned, and every destination on the departure board answered to the woman they had just humiliated. If you have ever been measured by people who never bothered to see your worth, stay with this one until the very end. Terminal 3 was loud that morning. Wheels rolled across the polished floor. Voices rose and fell. Somewhere a child laughed, and somewhere else a name was paged twice. Travelers moved in every direction, dragging suitcases, checking phones, chasing departures. But near Gate 41, a small circle of stillness formed around a woman holding a sick little boy, and the people who walked past slowed down without knowing why. Her name was Nalaya. She wore a plain gray coat and flat shoes, the kind a tired mother grabs without thinking. Her hair was pulled back simply. She wore no jewelry that anyone would notice. Her son, Tariq, was 4 years old and burning with fever. His cheek pressed against her neck. His small hand gripped the collar of her coat as if letting go would send him falling. Every few seconds he whimpered, a soft, broken sound, and she rocked him gently from side to side. In front of her stood her husband, Rashad. He wore a tailored navy suit and a watch that caught the light each time he moved his wrist. He did not look at his son. He looked at the gate, at the clock above it, then at the woman waiting a few steps behind him. His face wore the impatience of a man who had already decided how this morning would go. "He needs a doctor, Rashad," Nalaya said. Her voice was soft. She was not begging yet. She was only stating it, the way you state something that is simply true. "His fever climbed all night. I called the clinic. They can see him this afternoon if we leave now. Please, just come with us." Rashad sighed, like a man being asked to carry something heavy and unfair. "Then take him. Reschedule it yourself. I have a flight." "He has been asking for you all morning. Children ask for everything." He checked the watch again. "I have meetings on the other side of this trip. It was planned weeks ago. You knew that." "He is sick, Rashad. This is your son. And you are his mother. So mother him." His tone sharpened, the way it always did when he wanted to end a conversation. "I cannot drop everything because a child has a temperature. That is what you are for." A few steps behind him, the woman in the cream coat shifted her weight and smiled. Her name was Sloane. She was younger, polished, certain of herself in a way that did not need to try. Her hand rested lightly on the handle of an expensive bag, and her eyes moved over Nalaya the way a person looks at furniture left out on a curb, faintly curious, mostly bored. "We'll miss boarding, love," Sloane said gently, as if she were the reasonable one, as if she were doing everyone a favor by moving things along. That single word, love, landed in Nalaya's chest like a stone dropped into still water. She did not flinch, but she heard it. She heard everything. That was when Rashad's mother stepped forward. Esme had a way of arriving in a conversation like a change in weather. She looked Nalaya up and down, taking in the gray coat, the flat shoes, the tired eyes, the trembling child, and her lip curled. "Look at you," Esme said, loud enough for the people nearby to turn their heads. "Standing here in the middle of an airport making a scene. My son works himself to the bone, and this is what waits for him. A woman who cannot even keep a child from falling ill. A woman with no shine, no ambition, no grace. She clicked her tongue, slow and cruel. I told him years ago, before he ever put a ring on your finger. You were never first-class material, the words carried. A businessman lowered his newspaper. A young couple stopped pretending not to listen. A flight attendant passing with her bag slowed for half a step. Nalaya felt the heat climb her neck and bloom across her face. Shame is a strange and physical thing. It does not care whether the cruelty is true. It only knows that people are watching. But Nalaya did not answer. She did not raise her voice or defend herself or cry. She reached up and adjusted the blanket around Tariq's small shoulders, tucking it under his chin, and she held him a little closer to her heart. "Mama, please," Rashad said, but not because he disagreed with his mother. He said it because the boarding line had begun to move, and her speech was slowing him down. He turned to his wife one final time, and for a moment, something flickered in his face, something that might once have been tenderness. Then it closed like a door. "I'll call when I land. Handle the boy. Don't make this harder than it needs to be." Then he turned away from his sick son and his silent wife, and he offered his arm to Sloane. She took it without a second of hesitation. She leaned into him, laughed at something he murmured low and private against her ear, and the two of them walked toward the jet bridge like a couple stepping off the cover of a magazine. Esme followed close behind, chin lifted, heels clicking against the floor with satisfaction. Not one of the three of them looked back. Nalaya stood with her son in her arms and watched her husband's shoulders grow smaller and smaller until the tunnel that led to the plane swallowed him whole. At the desk beside the gate, a young agent had watched the entire thing unfold. She had careful eyes and a steady manner, and she had not said a word. But now she looked at Nalaya for a long, strange moment. Something moved across her face. First, it looked like recognition. Then it looked like disbelief, as if her mind could not fit what her eyes were telling her. Then, very deliberately, her expression went smooth and professional again. The way you school your face when you have just understood something you are not supposed to say out loud. She opened her mouth. She closed it. She said nothing at all, but she kept watching Nalaya long after the family had gone. And Nalaya, swaying gently to soothe the feverish boy against her shoulder, lifted her eyes to the wide departure board glowing above the terminal. Dozens of cities scrolled by, dozens of flights, Lagos, Atlanta, London, Accra, all those planes, all those people, all that endless motion crossing the sky. She did not cry. She breathed out slowly through her nose, long and even, as though she were setting something heavy down on the floor at last. Then she turned, shifted her son's weight, and carried him toward the exit. Her flat shoes made no sound on the polished floor. To understand why Nalaya did not cry, you have to understand where she came from. Because the woman in the gray coat had not always been quiet. She had only learned, through a long and careful life, that quiet was the safest place to keep the things that mattered most. She grew up at the ragged edge of an old airfield, in a small house where the windows rattled in their frames every time a plane lifted off. Her father, a broad-shouldered man everyone called Baba Idris, worked there. First he loaded cargo, hauling crates through the cold, dark hours before dawn, his breath fogging in the air. Later he learned engines. His hands were always stained with grease, always moving, always coaxing life back into machines that other men had given up on. They did not have much. Some weeks, the lights in the little house flickered because the bill had been paid late. Dinner was often simple, the same pot stretched across 3 nights. But Baba Idris carried a dream that was far too big for that little house, and he carried it the way other men carried lunch pails, every single day, without complaint. One plane, he used to tell young Nalaya, sitting beside her on the worn porch step as the sky turned the color of fire. I started with one leased plane that could barely get off the ground. They laughed at me, you understand? A cargo loader who wanted to own the sky. They said I had lost my mind. He would smile then, a slow and certain smile. But I knew something they did not. "What did you know, Baba?" she would ask, though she already knew the answer. She loved to hear him say it. He would tap his broad chest with one grease-stained finger. That the sky does not care who your father was. It does not care what you own or where you were born. It only cares whether you show up, every day, no matter what. She grew up inside that world. She knew the smell of jet fuel before she ever knew the smell of perfume. She fell asleep to the roar of engines and woke to the same sound. And while other girls her age dreamed of being noticed, of being seen and admired, Nalaya learned something rarer. She learned how to see. She learned how a real thing is built, not from the top down, but from the ground up, crate by crate, root by root, one handshake and one kept promise at a time. Her father taught her everything. How to read a balance sheet until the numbers told their secret story. How to listen in a meeting and hear the words a man was carefully not saying. How to watch a person's hands when they spoke. Because hands, her father told her, tell the truth that mouths spend all day hiding. And the thing Baba Idris built did not stay small. That single struggling plane became two, then a handful, then a fleet that darkened the runway with its shadow. The cargo loader they had laughed at became a name spoken with respect in rooms he was once not allowed to enter. The little airline that should have died in its first year instead grew into something vast, worth more than that laughing crowd could have imagined in their wildest dreams. And through all of it, Nalaya grew alongside it, until she understood every gear and bolt of the great machine her father had made. But the world only saw a quiet girl in plain clothes, and that was exactly how Baba Idris taught her to keep it. The night before he died, frail and small in his bed, his strong hands finally still, he pressed something cold into his daughter's palm. It was a brass pin shaped like a pilot's wings, worn smooth and shining from decades of riding in his pocket. He had carried it since his very first morning at that airfield, when he was nothing but a boy with a strong back and an impossible dream. "This is yours now," he whispered, his voice barely more than breath. "But listen to me, child. Listen carefully. The world will measure you by what they can see, by your coat, by your shoes, by the car you drive and the rooms you are seen in. Let them." His fingers, trembling now, closed her hand tightly around the pin. "Never tell them what you carry inside. Never announce it. Let them look right past you. And then, when the time is right, let them find out." She kept that pin from that day forward, fastened inside her coat, directly over her heart, where no one in the world could see it. So when she met Rashad, years later, she made a choice that would shape everything that came after. Rashad had been charming in those early days, ambitious and bright, a young man with empty pockets and enormous plans. And Nalaya, who had spent her entire life being valued for the empire behind her name, wanted just once, only once, to be chosen for who she was, and nothing more. So she did not tell him the truth. She let him believe she was an ordinary woman with an ordinary job and an ordinary family. She watched him fall in love with her plainness, and she let herself believe it was real. She wanted his love to be a true thing, freely given, not a love bought with her father's fortune or borrowed against her name. She married him for love, only love. And she hid the entire sky inside her gray coat, folded quietly next to her father's brass wings. For a long while, the silence served her well. Rashad rose in the world, year by year. He took a respected position at a major airline. And here lies the cruelest thread of the whole story, a thread he never once saw. That airline, behind its tall wall of holding companies and silent ownership and carefully buried paperwork, belonged to the very family he had married into. It belonged, in the end, to Nalaya. He never knew. He believed he had climbed every rung of that ladder with his own two hands. He believed his talent alone had lifted him, and Nalaya let him believe it, because she loved him, and because she had learned that a man's pride is a fragile and precious glass, and she wanted, in those early years, for him to feel tall and proud and entirely his own man. But pride that is not truly earned does not stay sweet. Left alone in the dark, it curdles. It turns rotten from the inside. The longer Rashad believed he had built his life with no help from anyone, the smaller and duller his wife appeared in his eyes. He began to see her plainness not as the peace it was, but as a kind of failure. He began to resent the very softness and quiet he had once claimed to love. A man who thinks he has climbed a mountain alone starts to despise anyone who reminds him of the valley. And then Sloane appeared. She moved in the orbit of important people, beautiful and sharp and quick, the kind of woman who could make a man feel like the brightest light in any room. She told Rashad exactly what his hungry pride wanted to hear, that he was wasted on a dull and simple wife, that a man of his rising importance deserved a woman who matched his shine and his ambition. That poor, plain Nalaya was lucky beyond measure to have caught him, and that he had been a fool to forget how far above her he truly stood. He drank those poisoned words like a man dying of thirst in a desert. The business trips grew longer and more frequent. The phone calls home grew shorter and colder, and Nalaya, who had been taught from childhood to see what others missed, noticed everything. She noticed the perfume on his collar that was not her own. She noticed the dinner receipts that were always for two. She noticed the way her husband's eyes went distant and glassy at the dinner table, as though his body sat across from her while his heart had boarded a flight to somewhere else. She saw all of it. That had always been her gift, and it had always been her wound. She could not stop herself from seeing the truth, even on the nights she prayed to be blind. Then Esme moved into their home. To help, she announced, with a bright and gracious smile. But help was the last thing the woman came to do. She came to rule. She rearranged the kitchen Nalaya had kept for years. She criticized, openly and constantly, the way Nalaya fed and dressed and raised little Tariq. And worst of all, she whispered to her son at night behind closed doors, her voice a slow and patient poison dripping into his ear. "She holds you back, my son. Anyone with eyes can see it. A man of your standing, of your future, chained to a gray little woman like that. You deserve so much more. You always have." And slowly, day by quiet day, the home that was truly Nalaya's became a place where she lived as an unwelcome guest. She was pushed gently and then firmly toward the edges of her own life. She was asked, in 100 small ways, to become smaller, quieter, less. And she allowed them to believe that she was shrinking, that she was fading, that she had nothing left inside her, because she had learned the oldest lesson of all from her father. Some people only reveal the full reach of their cruelty when they are certain you have nothing left to fight them with. Then Tariq got sick. Not the small passing sickness of a single, feverish morning, but something deeper and more frightening, something that demanded careful watching and long, sleepless nights, doctors and tests and waiting rooms and worry that sat on the chest like a stone. And through every moment of it, Nalaya was utterly alone. She sat in hard plastic chairs under cold, fluorescent lights, with her son's small, hot hand wrapped in hers, while her phone lit up with photographs Rashad had posted from a sunlit beach. In each one, Sloan laughed in the surf beside him, golden and careless, while his child trembled in a hospital across the world. One evening, a sharp-suited lawyer that Esme had quietly hired slid a stack of papers across the dining table toward Nalaya. "Sign the house over," the papers suggested in their cold and tidy language. "Step aside gracefully. Make all of this simple and clean." "Disappear," the papers meant, though they were too polite to use the word. Nalaya looked down at those papers for a long, long time. The clock on the wall ticked. Tariq slept fitfully in the next room. And something deep inside her went very, very still. Not broken. People expected broken. Broken would have been easy for them to handle. No, this was something else entirely. It was the stillness of the air just before a great storm turns and changes the shape of everything in its path. She did not sign. That night, after Tariq had finally fallen into a deep and easier sleep, his fever broken at last, Nalaya sat alone in the dark of her living room. She reached inside her coat and drew out the brass wings, holding them in her open palm the way her father had once held them in his. The faint light from the window caught the worn metal. She thought about all the long years she had spent being quiet, all the countless times she had let them measure her by the gray coat and the flat shoes and the bowed and patient head. Then she thought about her son, about Tariq, watching, learning, even now, even this young, exactly what a mother is worth from the way the world chose to treat his. And Nalaya picked up her phone. The person on the other end of the line answered before the first ring had even finished, because some calls, in some lives, are always answered first. "It's time," she said. 2 words, nothing more. Then she set the phone gently down on the table beside her father's wings, and for the first time in what felt like 100 years, Nalaya smiled in the dark. The airline was hosting a gala. It was the kind of glittering evening that fills a grand hall with golden light and soft music, and the most important people in the city, all of them wrapped in clothes that cost more than most families saw in a year. The occasion was a celebration of the airline's triumphant new routes, its record-breaking year, its dazzling future stretching out ahead like a runway into the sun. Everyone who mattered in that entire world would be there beneath the chandeliers. Rashad made very certain that he was there too. He arrived with Sloan draped on his arm like a prize, wrapped in a gown that shimmered with every step she took, and Esme sailed in beside them, glowing with a pride she had not earned. This, Rashad believed, deep in his chest, was the world he was always meant to belong to. The world of first class. He moved through the crowded room, shaking hands too eagerly, laughing a beat too loudly, his eyes bright with the certainty that he had finally arrived at the top of everything. "To think where you started," Sloan murmured to him, her painted lips close to his ear, her eyes glittering as they swept across the wealthy room. "A nobody from nowhere. And look at you now, standing at the very top of it all. He believed her completely. That had always been his fatal weakness. He believed every soul who flattered him and dismissed the only one who had ever told him the truth. Then the warm lights of the hall began to dim. A hush rolled across the crowd like a wave drawing back from the shore, and the host stepped up to the gleaming microphone at the center of the stage. For many years, the host began, his voice carrying to every corner of the silent hall, this airline of ours has been guided by a single, steady vision. A vision that began many decades ago with one struggling leased plane and one stubborn man who refused, against every reasonable odd, to quit. A murmur of appreciation moved through the crowd. Most of you gathered here tonight have never met the person who carries that vision forward today. By her own choice, she has remained entirely out of the spotlight, steering this great company quietly and brilliantly from behind the scenes, asking for no credit and no applause. Rashad clapped politely, along with the room, his mind half on the champagne in his hand and the beautiful woman on his arm. Owners and chairmen and silent partners meant very little to him on a night like this. He was here to be seen, not to admire someone else. But tonight, the host continued, and something in his voice made the whole room lean in. For the very first time, she has agreed to step forward into the light. Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome the heart, the vision, and the owner of everything you see around you this evening. A single bright spotlight swung upward and found the top of the grand staircase at the side of the hall, and Nalaya walked down. The gray coat was gone. The flat shoes were gone. She wore a gown of deep midnight blue, simple and clean and powerful in its quiet. Her shoulders were straight, her chin was level, her steps were certain. And there, gleaming on her lapel for all the watching world to see at last, caught in the bright white light, was a small brass pin shaped like a pair of wings. The room erupted into warm applause. Phones and cameras rose into the air. People who had walked past this woman 100 times in their lives, who had brushed against her on the street and looked clean through her, now leaned forward in their seats, straining to see the face of the woman they had never once bothered to truly look at. Rashad's champagne glass froze halfway to his open mouth. His mind rejected it at first, violently, the way a body rejects a thing it cannot survive believing. It was not possible. It could not be. His wife, his dull, plain, gray little wife in her flat shoes. The woman he had left, standing at a departure gate, holding a sick and crying child, while he walked off laughing with another woman on his arm. But it was her. There was no mistaking her now. Calm, radiant, utterly unhurried. Looking out across the vast and glittering room that belonged, every inch of it, to her. Sloane's bright smile slid off her face like wet paint sliding down a pane of glass. Esme's jeweled hand flew up to her own chest, gripping at the pearls there, and Rashad simply stood frozen in the center of the crowd, the truth crashing over him slowly, in a great and terrible wave that stole the air from his lungs. Nalaya reached the bottom of the staircase. The applause settled into a hush of anticipation. And then, somewhere in the silence, the first phone buzzed. It was Rashad's. He looked down at it on instinct. A message from the airline's own internal system glowed on the screen. His executive flight privileges had been reviewed and revoked, effective immediately. He stared at the words, his brow furrowing in confusion. Then the phone buzzed again. His corporate access card, deactivated across the entire network. Then it buzzed a third time. The private jet he had quietly booked for the following week, a sunlit escape to the coast with Sloane, was no longer authorized for his use. Grounded. And then, one after another, the notifications came faster than he could read them. His name flagged at every gate, his clearances stripped, his standing dissolved. One by one, screen by screen, in perfect cold silence, the very system that Rashad had used to feel so powerful and so tall turned itself against him and locked him out. The status that had let him sneer at his own wife and walk away from his own sick child was being peeled away from him in real time, quietly, mechanically, methodically, without a single voice being raised anywhere in the room. He looked up slowly from the dark screen, his face drained of all its color now, and he met his wife's steady eyes across the bright and crowded hall. Nalaya did not shout. She did not point a finger or raise her voice or let a single drop of triumph touch her face. She simply looked at him. She looked at him the way a person looks at something small they had once badly mistaken for something large and important. "You said I was not first-class material," she said. Her voice was quiet and even, but the hall had gone so completely silent that every soul in it heard each word land. "You were right, Rashad. I was never first class." She let the silence stretch, long and deliberate, until the whole room held its breath. "I owned the airline." Then she turned away from him. She turned her back on her husband and his mistress and his mother, as though they had simply ceased to exist, and she lifted her glass to the room full of important people, and she smiled at them, warm and gracious and free, as if Rashad were not worth the cost of one more second of her attention. After that night, the fall came fast, and it came hard. Rashad lost the position he had always believed he had earned with his own talent. The truth was that it had only ever been his because of the family he married into, and now that great door had swung shut and locked behind him forever. Without the title, without the access, without the powerful name of the airline standing behind him, he was revealed at last for exactly what he was. A man in an expensive suit with nothing inside it. The industry that had once nodded to him in hallways and laughed at his jokes now turned its collective back. His name became a quiet, cautionary lesson, passed in low voices between people who knew the whole story, a warning about the true and final cost of cruelty. Sloane did not stay to watch him sink beneath the waves. The very moment the privileges vanished, the jets and the access and the borrowed shine all evaporating into nothing, she felt the cold rush in around her like water into a sinking boat. She had never loved Rashad, not for one single day. She had loved the warmth he stood near, the heat of the fire he had only ever been borrowing. And when that fire went dark and cold, she gathered her expensive things in silence and left him without so much as a goodbye, already turning her sharp and searching eyes toward the next bright and warm window she could press herself against. Rashad called her name into the silence of an empty apartment. No one answered him. No one ever would again. Esme fared no better than her son. The gala had been filled wall to wall with the very people she had spent her entire bitter life straining to impress, and every one of them had watched her stand and boast loudly about her brilliant son only moments before. The whole world learned the staggering truth. She became a story now, a delicious and shameful story told at dinner tables across the city. The proud and cruel mother who had publicly mocked the very woman who quietly signed her son's paychecks. Her invitations stopped arriving. Her telephone fell silent, and the fine home she had so carefully schemed to take away from Nalaya was no longer a place where she was welcome to set foot. She left it the same way she had first come into it, with sharp words and a high, proud chin. But this time, there was no audience to perform for, and the silence that met her was its own quiet and fitting punishment. Nalaya did not chase a single one of them. She did not need to lift a finger. She had learned long ago, at her father's knee on that worn porch, that you do not ever have to push people off a ledge that they are already walking toward with their own 2 feet. She turned all of her attention, instead, to the only thing in the world that had ever truly mattered to her. She brought Tariq the very best doctors that could be found anywhere. She sat beside his small bed through every hard and frightening night, holding his hand, singing softly and slowly, day by day. She watched the warm color return to his round cheeks. She watched his laughter come back. She secured full and final custody of her son, the papers signed quietly and without drama, so that the boy's life from this day forward would be steady and safe and unshakable. And then she folded the long chapter of Rashad, gently closed, without bitterness and without hatred, because she understood that bitterness is a heavy stone, and she refused to carry one single ounce of it into all the bright years she still had left to build. She walked away from the wreckage of it all with her head level and her steps slow and even. She had nothing left to prove to anyone. The truth is, she never had. Some months later, the old airfield lay warm and golden under the soft light of a late afternoon. The windows of the little house no longer rattled in their frames, because the house had been lovingly rebuilt, every board and beam of it. But the planes still rose into the wide sky beyond it, climbing steadily into the very same air that Baba Idris had once taught his small daughter to love with her whole heart. Nalaya stood now on the porch where she had sat as a girl, watching the deep orange light spread itself slow and lazy across the long runway. Out on the grass, Tariq ran. He was healthy now, fully and finely healthy, his cheeks full and his eyes bright, and he laughed as he ran with his thin arms spread wide on either side of him like a pair of wings. He was chasing the long shadow of a plane that climbed into the sky above him, the way small children chase after things they do not yet fully understand, but already, somehow, love down to their bones. Nalaya called him over to her. He came running at once, breathless and grinning, and tumbled happily into her waiting lap, all knees and elbows and joy. She reached into her coat and drew out the brass pin shaped like wings, the same pin her father had pressed into her trembling hand on his last night. The same pin she had hidden over her own beating heart through all the long and silent years. She turned it once, slowly, letting the late sun catch and gleam along its worn and shining edge. Then, very carefully, she pinned it onto the front of her son's small jacket, right over his heart, exactly where it belonged. "This is yours now," she said softly to him, speaking the very same words that had once been spoken to her in a quiet, dark room so long ago. "Carry it where they cannot see it, my love. Let them look right past you and never mind it. And then one day, when the time is right, you let them find out." Tariq looked down at the gleaming wings now resting on his chest. Then he tipped his head back and looked up at the great plains climbing the endless sky above him. And he smiled the wide and certain and untroubled smile of a small boy who has no earthly idea how strong his mother truly is, only that she is, without any question, the safest and warmest place in the entire world. The people who judge your worth by what they can see will always underestimate what you carry inside. Let them. Build in silence. Stand in patience. Hold your value close to your heart. And when the moment comes, you won't need to prove a thing. Real power never announces itself. If Nalaya's story spoke to you, tell us in the comments. What is one thing you'd want the people who underestimated you to finally understand? Like this video if you believe dignity always outlasts cruelty, and subscribe for more powerful stories of betrayal, resilience, and unforgettable reversals.